we go. Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. Hope everybody's doing well. Welcome to the third edition of Fireside Chats with Dave. My name is Dave Moore. I'm the museum manager at the McKeesport Regional History and Heritage Center. And we thank you for joining us from my living room once again tonight to discuss the history of golf in Western Pennsylvania. This week just happens to be perfect timing with Mother's Day this weekend, that we are going to be talking about the history of women's golf in Western Pennsylvania. And I'm going to specifically focus on two areas. First, the major championships that have been contested in women's golf in our area, and then three key figures of female golfers from Western Pennsylvania. So let's jump right into it, and we're going to start with the major championships that have been contested in Western Pennsylvania on the women's circuit. There have been a total of 5 major U.S. women's tournaments contested in Western Pennsylvania. There have been 2 women's PGA championships and 3 U.S. women's opens. And those 5 tournaments have been hosted by 2 courses in our area. The first, which has hosted 3, was a Churchill Valley Country Club, which is no longer in existence. And then there have been 2 tournaments hosted by Oakmont Country Club. The very first women's major in our area dates back to 1957, and it was the 3rd year overall for this event, and that was the Women's PGA Championship. And this event was hosted at Churchill Valley Country Club, which opened for play in 1932 in Churchill, just below the present location of the Parkway and Penn Hills. Now, when Churchill hosted the 1957 Women's PGA Championship, it played at a par 71 and just over 5,700 yards total. And the winner of that inaugural women's major in Western PA was none other than the LPGA founder and president, Louise Suggs. Suggs shot a 5-over, 285 over 4 rounds at Churchill Valley and took home a modest prize of a little over $1,000 for her win. The course did so well in the 57 tournament that the LPGA brought it back once again in 1958 for another year of the tournament. And that year, it was at Churchill Valley once again, but the course played at a par 70 and played about 300 yards longer at 6,025 yards. And the winner of the 1958 Women's PGA at Churchill Valley was Mickey Wright. She shot a 8-over, 288 spread over 4 rounds, and it was the first of 13 career major championships for Mickey. And Mickey is currently second all-time on the women's major championship list. And she actually just recently passed away in February of 2020. The following year, the very first U.S. Women's Open was contested in our area, and yet again, Churchill Valley Country Club was the host. The course still played at a par 70, but played at 6,200 yards for this edition of the tournament, but it had a very similar champion. The winner in 1959 in the U.S. Women's Open was none other than Mickey Wright, who had won the 1958 tournament. Wright won her 2nd consecutive U.S. Women's Open and her 3rd career major overall when she defeated Louise Suggs by 2 shots when she shot a 287 7-over total for 4 rounds of golf. And to put in perspective how much money Mickey earned for her U.S. Women's Open win, it was $1,800, which is in today's Women's Open tournament, the winner is looking at somewhere from $500,000 to $1 million for that win. So quite a jump in recent years, considering what the ladies were earning when they won back in the 50s. It would be another 30 years before the Women's Open would return to Western Pennsylvania, and when it did in 1992, it came for the very first time to Oakmont Country Club. Now, Oakmont for the Women's Open played at a par 71 and at 6,312 yards. And the tournament itself came down to two former college roommates, Julie Inkster and the eventual champion Patty Sheehan. Now, Inkster played incredibly well all week, and in fact, she went into the 71st hole of the tournament with a two-shot lead over her former roommate, Patty Sheehan. Unfortunately, a thunderstorm hit, and during this delay in play, Patty Sheehan went to the locker room, and as she tells it, gave herself a real tough love lesson and gave herself a little bit of a screaming match. And when she went back out onto the course, she birdied the final two holes to tie Inkster and then would go on to win the subsequent 18-hole playoff to earn her first U.S. Women's Open and the third of 6 career major championships. And the U.S. Women's Open would return to Oakmont one more time, and that was 18 years later in 2010. The 2010 edition of the tournament still saw the course played at par 71, would add roughly 200 yards to the overall length of the course, coming in at 6,568 yards total. And the winner of the 2010 U.S. Women's Open at Oakmont was none other than the Pink Panther herself, Paula Creamer. Now, Creamer had been on tour for roughly 5 years when she won her very first major at Oakmont in 2010. And it was an impressive victory for 2 reasons. First of all, she was the only player under par the entire week. She shot 3 under for the tournament, and the next closest competitor was 1 over par. So Oakmont played to its typical difficult level for the women in 2010. But what's the most impressive thing about Creamer's win was just 4 months prior, she underwent major reconstructive surgery on her wrist after she tore several tendons in that wrist. And she was limited to just 30 warm-up shots per day, and that allowed her to really focus on her putting and her chipping, which is key to winning at Oakmont. And as you can see, it paid off for Paula as she won her first and so far only career major championship, but she won it in our backyard. So those are the 5 majors that have been contested in Western Pennsylvania over the last 60 years as far as the women's game is concerned. And there's a hope that the Women's Open will return in the near future, and we'll get to see the best women in golf tee it up in Western Pennsylvania. Now that we've talked about the courses, let's talk about the key figures of female golfers in Western Pennsylvania. And I'm going to focus on 3 specific people in this section. The very first USGA champion from Western Pennsylvania, one of the better players from our area, and then arguably the greatest American female amateur golfer of all time. So let's start with the very first USGA champion, and that is Dorothy Campbell Hurd. Dorothy was born in the 1880s, and she didn't move to Pittsburgh until 1914, but she is considered the first female USGA champion from Western Pennsylvania. She would win the U.S. Women's Amateur in 1909, defend that title in 1910, and then she would take it home for a third time in 1924, the very same year that she would also win the British Women's Amateur Championship. She also won 3 consecutive West Penn Women's Championships from 1914 till 1916, and unfortunately, she died in a tragic train accident when she was in her, I believe, her 60s. So a very sad end to our region's first women's champion. The next golfer I'd like to highlight is Judy Oliver. Now, Judy was born in 1947, and she grew up on the links of Fox Chapel Golf Club, where she learned the game from her mother, who was an accomplished player in her own right. In 1978, Judy finished runner-up in the U.S. Women's Amateur Championship, that year contested at Sunnybrook Country Club, which is just outside of Philadelphia. She would go on to win 4 West Penn Women's Championships and 3 Pennsylvania State Women's Amateur Championships. She would play on 3 U.S. Curtis Cup teams, and she would also captain the 1992 U.S. Curtis Cup team. Unfortunately, Judy passed away in 2000 at the young age of 54 years old after a long battle with lung cancer. And finally, the last person I want to highlight as far as the women's game is concerned, as I mentioned earlier, is arguably the greatest female amateur golfer, certainly in American golf history and possibly in all of golf history. And that is none other than Sewickley's own Carol Semple Thompson. Now, Carol was born into a golfing family in 1947. Her father, Harton, known as Bud, was an avid golfer, a member at Allegheny Country Club, the founder of Sewickley Heights Golf Club in 1961, and he would rise to be the president of the United States Golf Association in the mid-1970s. Now, Carol's mother, Phyllis, was also an avid golfer and quite an accomplished talent in her own right, as she took home 6 West Penn Women's Championships over her career. Now, as Carol likes to tell the story, all of her brothers and sisters were not forced to play golf, but certainly encouraged. And her parents had a strict rule when it came to golf. If you wanted to quit the game, that was fine, but you had to break 90 first. So you had to shoot less than 90 over 18 holes before Bud and Phyllis Semple would allow their children to quit the game. And while several of Carol's siblings did, in fact, break 90 and then quit the game, Carol made a career out of her golfing prowess and flourished in the game of golf. In 1965, she won her very first major tournament, which was the West Penn Women's Championship, and she defeated her mother in the final match to take home the trophy. In 1973, she would win the U.S. Amateur Championship, and her father, who was the then vice president of the United States Golf Association, got to award his daughter the trophy that year. Carol would be the runner-up in the 1974 U.S. Women's Amateur, and she would take home the British Women's Amateur trophy that same year. In 1990, she would win the first of 2 U.S. Women's Mid-Amateur Championships. She would win the other in 1997. But the 1990 edition, she won on her home course of Allegheny Country Club. In 1990, Carol would begin a reign of 4 consecutive U.S. Senior Women's Amateur Championships, including the third, which she won at Allegheny Country Club during the week of the September 11th attacks on the United States. And in fact, she told me a couple years ago that there was a lot of discussions of whether the tournament would continue, and it came down to the players to decide whether or not the championship would be finished that week. And Carol took home the trophy at her home course, which is a really neat story. Just a couple more facts and figures as far as Carol's concerned. She would be a 21-time winner of the Pennsylvania State Women's Amateur Championship. She would win 12 total West Penn Women's Amateur Championships. She would play on 12 U.S. Curtis Cup teams and captain 2 more in 2006 and 2008. Both teams won the tournament. She has served on the USGA Executive Committee for many years, and in 2003 was awarded the USGA's highest annual honor, the Bob Jones Award. In 2008, she was inducted into the World Golf Hall of Fame, joining fellow Western Pennsylvanian Arnold Palmer with that distinction. And just I think a very impressive fact about Carol, she has 7 USGA titles to her name, but she is one of only 5 golfers in American golf history that has 3 different USGA individual titles to her credit. Of course, she won the U.S. Women's Amateur, the U.S. Women's Mid-Amateur, and the U.S. Senior Women's Amateur. And she joins Joanne Carner, Arnold Palmer, Jack Nicklaus, and Tiger Woods as the only 5 golfers to hold 3 separate USGA individual titles. Carol, as I mentioned, was born in Sewickley and is still a resident of our area. And she still calls Allegheny Country Club her home course. And I was lucky enough a couple years ago to do an oral history with Carol. She is by far one of the kindest and most humble individuals I have ever met, especially considering her pedigree and her track record and the amount of tournaments she's won. She's won over 60 events in her career. And as I said, just an absolutely wonderful person. And I hope she gets to win a couple more before her career is over. So that is a brief history of women's golf in Western Pennsylvania. I thank you all for tuning in. If you have missed any of our previous chapters on the history of golf in Western Pennsylvania, you can check out our YouTube page or our Facebook page, and you'll be able to watch chapters 1 and 2. And I'm sure later tonight, this edition, chapter 3, will be available for you to watch. I hope everybody's doing well. I know we're all probably getting a little stir crazy, and hopefully we'll be back to the center soon, and we'll be able to do these kind of programs in person. I thank you all for tuning in. And as I said, I really hope we'll get to see you all soon. If you have any questions for me, you can comment on this video or send a message to us on either of our social media platforms, whether that's Facebook or Instagram, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. And I hope you all stay safe, stay well, practice social distancing, and we'll see you all next week. As I mentioned, that next week we will be coming on at a later time as our organization has to do our board meeting at 6 o'clock. So we wanted to give ourselves a little bit of a cushion. So plan for an 8 o'clock show next week where we will discuss the U.S. Amateur Championship in Western Pennsylvania. Thank you all for tuning in again, and we'll see you next week. Have a good one.